My daughter's name is Iris. She has her mother's eyes, dark green, the kind that catch light in a room and hold it. Her mother passed 11 years ago, and ever since, it's just been the two of us. I want you to understand that before anything else, because it explains everything that came after. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers, retired as a senior project manager, and then spent another 8 years consulting for infrastructure firms across the Southeast. I'm not a man who raises his voice. I'm not a man who makes threats he doesn't intend to keep. I learned a long time ago that the quietest person in the room is usually the most dangerous, and I learned that because for most of my career that person was me. I say all of this not to brag. I say it so you understand what kind of man was sitting at that dinner table the night my son-in-law grabbed my daughter's wrist and yanked her sideways so hard she hit her shoulder on the corner of the sideboard and went down to one knee on the hardwood floor. I say it so you understand what kind of man stayed in his seat. The dinner was a Sunday in late October. Iris and her husband Garrett had moved into a house in Alpharetta, Georgia, about 14 months prior. A 5-bedroom colonial in one of those developments where every house looks like a slightly different version of the same house. I'd driven up from Macon that afternoon, 3.5 hours with the traffic around Atlanta. I brought a bottle of Bordeaux I'd been saving, a good one, the kind you open for a reason. Garrett's parents were there too. His father, Leonard, I'll call him that because it suits him, stiff and a little outdated, worked in commercial real estate, the kind of man who talks about square footage the way other men talk about their children. His mother, Renee, was one of those women who smiles with her teeth but not her eyes. She'd never warmed to Iris. I noticed it the first time I met her 2 years before the wedding, and I filed it away. Iris had cooked. She always cooked when I came up. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, the things her mother used to make. She'd been in the kitchen most of the afternoon. I could see her through the doorway when I arrived, moving between the stove and the counter, and she smiled when she saw me. A real smile. Tired but real. Garrett was in the living room watching football with his father. He shook my hand when I came in. He had one of those handshakes that communicates exactly nothing. Not firm, not weak, just the shape of a handshake. He'd been like that since they got married. Cordial in the way a store clerk is cordial, technically present. We sat down around 6. The conversation was the usual kind. Work, the neighborhood, some project of Leonard's in Buckhead. Renee asked about my consulting work in a tone that suggested she wasn't particularly interested in the answer. I answered anyway briefly. Iris kept refilling glasses and passing dishes, and I watched her the way you watch your child even when they're 34 years old and live in someone else's house in someone else's suburb. I watched the way she glanced at Garrett before she spoke. I watched the way she laughed a half-second after everyone else, checking the room first. I had been watching that for about 8 months by then, that particular hesitation, and I didn't like what it meant. After dinner, Iris brought out a pie, apple, from scratch, and Garrett made some comment about the crust. Not a compliment, a critique. Said it tasted like the filling-to-crust ratio was off, said it lightly, like a joke, and looked at his mother when he said it. Renee made a small sound, the kind that's worse than a laugh. Iris smiled and said she'd work on it. I looked at my daughter's face when she said that. She'd been making that pie since she was 16 years old. She'd made it for her mother the last Thanksgiving her mother was well enough to sit at a table. I had one more glass of wine and let the moment pass. What happened came about 40 minutes later. We'd moved to the living room. Iris was clearing the last of the dishes, going back and forth from the dining room to the kitchen. On one of those trips she miscounted the glasses, and 2 of them clinked together, and one of them, a cheap one, not even the good crystal, chipped at the rim. She said, "Oh, shoot," under her breath. That's all. Oh, shoot. Garrett was across the room, and he covered the distance faster than I expected. He took her wrist in his hand and pulled, the way you'd pull something you were angry at, not the way you touch a person you love, and the momentum of it swung her sideways and her shoulder caught the edge of the sideboard and she went down to one knee, the intact glasses tilting in her hand, and she caught herself, and she didn't make a sound. That last part is the part that still keeps me up at night. She didn't make a sound, which meant it wasn't the first time her body had learned to absorb it quietly. Renee said from the couch, in a perfectly conversational voice, "She's always been clumsy." Leonard said nothing. He looked at the television. Garrett picked up the chipped glass and examined it and set it on the sideboard. He didn't look at Iris on the floor. I looked at my daughter. She was getting to her feet already, reorganizing the glasses in her hands, and she looked at me for just a moment. 1 second, maybe less, and what I saw in her face was not pain and not anger. It was something worse than both of those. It was the look of someone who has already explained to themselves why this is normal. I stood up and said I needed some air and excused myself, out through the back door. I stood in their backyard in the October cold for about 4 minutes. There was a street light 1 yard over, casting a yellow rectangle across the grass. I could hear the television through the glass. I took up my phone and I made a call. The man I called is named Vernon. We served together, not in combat but in the Corps, on a bridge reconstruction project in the Mississippi Delta back in 1994. Vernon went a different direction after government work. He spent 12 years at the FBI field office in Atlanta, then left and started a private investigative firm that handled mostly corporate fraud cases. Smart man. Meticulous. The kind of man who, when you call him at 9 on a Sunday night, doesn't ask unnecessary questions. I told him what I had just witnessed. I told him what I had been observing for the past 8 months. I told him I needed to understand the full picture before I did anything, because I was not a man who acted on one piece of information, and because my daughter was still inside that house and I needed to be careful. Vernon said, "Give me 2 weeks." I went back inside. I helped Iris finish clearing the table. I kissed her on the forehead when I left, and I said, "I love you, sweetheart." And she said, "Love you too, Dad." And I drove the 3.5 hours back to Macon, and I sat in my kitchen until almost 2 in the morning. I did not sleep well that night. The 2 weeks Vernon asked for turned into 3, because what he found took longer to document properly. He called me on a Thursday afternoon and said he wanted to meet in person, and I drove back up to Atlanta the following day. We sat across from each other in a diner off ITAV, and he slid a manila folder across the table. What was inside was not what I had expected to find, and I had already expected something bad. Garrett's company. He ran a small logistics firm, mid-sized fleet management, about 40 employees, had 2 active complaints filed against him by former female employees. One was a hostile workplace claim, filed 18 months ago, currently in arbitration. The other was more recent, filed just 7 months back, involving what the documentation described as physical intimidation in a workplace setting. That one had been settled out of court for an amount Vernon had obtained through a source I didn't ask about. Non-disclosure agreement attached. The financial picture was its own document. Iris had been a marketing manager before the wedding. Good salary, good benefits. 14 months after they married, she'd left her job. Vernon had traced the timeline. She'd left 2 weeks after their joint bank account was opened, and 3 weeks after Garrett had added himself as a co-signer on her car loan. By the time of that Sunday dinner, every bill, every account, every financial instrument they shared ran through Garrett as primary. Iris had a personal checking account with $1,100 in it. She had a master's degree in communications. She'd been up for a director-level position when she resigned. I sat in that diner booth and I read every page and I did not say anything for a while. Vernon waited. "He's good at that." I finally said, "His father, Leonard." "What's Leonard's exposure?" Vernon had thought I might ask that. He had a second folder. Leonard's commercial real estate business had 3 properties with county zoning variances that didn't entirely withstand scrutiny, the kind of variances that get approved faster when certain relationships are in place. Nothing prosecutable on its own, but the kind of thing that, if a formal audit were requested through the right channels, would create significant disruption in cost and unwanted attention. I closed both folders and thanked Vernon and paid for the coffee and drove home. I did not contact Garrett. I did not confront Leonard. I did not call Iris and tell her what I knew, because I had learned by then that this was not my story to drive. It was hers, and the only thing I could do was make sure she had the road clear when she was ready. But I could make some preparations. I want to explain something about how I see situations like this, because I think people sometimes imagine that a father in my position wants to do something dramatic, wants to show up at the door, wants to have words, wants the confrontation. And yes, a part of me did. I am not going to lie to you. I am 63 years old and I watched my daughter get pulled to the floor by a man who had a closet full of her things and her signature on his mortgage, and part of me wanted to handle it the old-fashioned way. But the old-fashioned way would have landed me in a Fulton County courtroom and done nothing to change my daughter's situation. probably would have made it worse. Men like Garrett know how to use other people's anger against them. I had watched him do it to Iris for over a year. I wasn't going to give him that. So I thought instead. Had a colleague, we're both retired now, named Paul. Paul spent the last decade of his career with the Army Corps as a liaison to FEMA and also, quietly, to several congressional offices in Georgia and Alabama. He knows people. More specifically, he knows the kind of people who sit on the boards of the county commissions that approve commercial zoning variances. I called Paul on a Tuesday morning in early December, and I had a conversation. I didn't ask for anything specific. I asked questions about processes, about how variance review boards operated, about what triggers a formal audit, about timelines. Paul, who is not a slow man, understood what I was asking beneath what I was asking, and he said he'd look into some things. He called back in 10 days. I will not describe that entire conversation. What I will tell you is that by the second week of January, Leonard's 3 variance properties were under an informal compliance review, voluntary, framed as routine, but with the unmistakable quality of something that does not simply go away. Around the same time, I contacted a woman named Dr. Anita Reeves, a licensed family therapist in Buckhead who specializes in domestic abuse cases. I'd found her through a network a former colleague's wife had recommended. I didn't ask Dr. Reeves to contact my daughter. I asked her instead to send Iris information. Nothing intrusive. A pamphlet from a support organization, mailed to the house, addressed to Iris by name. Just so that when the moment came, Iris would know that something existed on the other side. I also called my attorney, a woman named Beverly who has handled my affairs for 15 years. I told Beverly I wanted to understand the process for establishing a separate financial account in my daughter's name that I could fund without Garrett's knowledge or access. Beverly explained the structure, and I set it up. It had $25,000 in it by February. I told Iris about the account on a Wednesday afternoon in early March. I drove up to Alpharetta, took her to lunch at a restaurant we used to go to when she was in college, a quiet Italian place on Canton Street. I told her what I had done. Not all of it, but the account, and what it meant that she had options, that there was money she could access immediately if she ever needed it, that no one could touch, that had no strings. She sat across from me and she was quiet for a long time. She held her water glass with both hands. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." She started crying, the slow kind. Not dramatic, just tears coming down steadily while she sat there composed. And she said she was sorry, and I told her there was absolutely nothing to apologize for. And I meant it with every cell in my body. She said she hadn't left because she didn't know how to explain it. Because from the outside it looked fine, because she was embarrassed, because he had told her, enough times and in enough ways, that she was the problem, and she had partially believed him, the way you believe something when you're surrounded by it, and exhausted by it, and there's no one handing you the other version. I told her, your mother would have wanted you to hear this. You are the most capable person I know. He didn't change that. He just hid it from you for a while. She left in April. She called me on a Friday night and said she'd packed what she needed, that she was at a hotel, that she was okay. I was in my car and on I-75 North within 20 minutes. I sat with her in that hotel room until past midnight, and we ate pizza from a box and watched whatever was on television, and she slept and I did not. The divorce process was not simple. Garrick's attorney, a man named Patterson who specialized in making things complicated and expensive, pushed back on nearly everything. The asset division, the account questions, the timeline of her employment departure. It stretched over 7 months. What it did not involve at any point was Leonard's zoning properties, because Leonard, who had received a letter from a county compliance office in early spring and who had spent the intervening months increasingly aware that the review was not going away, came to Garrett in June and told his son, in terms I was not present for but have been told were not gentle, that he needed to settle the divorce cleanly and stop making it difficult, that certain family matters needed to be resolved without additional public attention. I know this because Iris's attorney called her in late June and said that Garrett's attorney was suddenly interested in reaching a resolution. The settlement was finalized in October. Iris walked away with her fair share of the equity in the house, a portion of the joint accounts that reflected her contributions, and a clean separation of finances. She got her name off his mortgage. She got her car back in her own name. She got herself back. She's living in a rental in Decatur now, Smaller but hers entirely, and she started consulting work in January, using everything she'd built before she'd walked away from it. And she's good at it. She was always good at it. And the calls I get from her now are a different kind than the ones I used to get. Less careful. More like her. I think about that Sunday in October sometimes. Standing in the backyard in the cold, looking at the yellow rectangle of streetlight on the grass, and I think about the 4 minutes I spent out there before I made that call. I think about what I wanted to do and what I chose to do instead. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I did not give Garrett the satisfaction of seeing me come undone over something he decided didn't count. I just made a phone call to an old friend and started paying attention, the way I had been trained for 31 years to pay attention, systematically, patiently, without emotion, with a very clear idea of the outcome I was working toward. Some people think patience is passive. In my experience, patience is the most aggressive thing in the world if you know how to aim it. My daughter is 35 years old and she is free and she has her mother's eyes, and when she smiles now, she doesn't check the room first. That is everything. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, more than a year now, and I still think about that Sunday evening in October. The yellow light on the grass, the cold air, the sound of the television coming through the glass door while my daughter was somewhere inside putting herself back together the way she apparently had done many times before I ever knew to look. People ask me sometimes, not many people, because I don't talk about this widely, whether I regret not acting sooner, whether I should have said something the first time I noticed the way Iris checked the room before she left, whether I should have pulled Garrett aside after one of those dinners where something felt slightly wrong but nothing I could point to directly. I've thought about that. My honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that I couldn't have done what I did before I had the full picture, and I couldn't have given Iris what she needed before she was ready to receive it. There is a version of this story where I charged in too early, made noise, gave Garrett something to use against her, and she spent another 3 years inside that house because I had made leaving feel like choosing a side in someone else's fight. I've seen that happen. I didn't want it to happen to my daughter. What I came to understand, slowly, uncomfortably, is that the people who cause harm the way Garrett caused harm are not simply angry men who lose control. They are systematic. They are patient in their own way. They build structures around the people they want to control. Financial structures, social structures, the slow architecture of self-doubt. Garrett had been working on Iris since before they were married probably, and by the time I understood what I was looking at, she had been living inside something he had constructed so carefully that it felt to her like just the shape of her own life. You cannot demolish that kind of structure with noise. You demolish it the same way it was built, carefully, methodically, one support at a time. That's not patience for its own sake. That's intelligence applied to a problem that deserves to be solved correctly. I think about what Iris said at that restaurant in March when I told her about the account. She asked how long I had known. And when I told her, she apologized. She sat there with her water glass and her tears, and she said she was sorry, and I have thought about that moment more than almost any other moment in my life, because what she was really saying was that she had believed, for a long time, that she had made herself into someone who deserved to be apologized for. That is what the Garretts of the world actually take from you. Not your money, not your independence. Those are recoverable. What they take is your sense of your own worth. And they take it so gradually and so quietly that you don't notice the loss until you're sitting in a restaurant wondering why your father is looking at you like you're still the person he's always known you to be. Iris is that person. She was always that person. Garrett didn't change her. He just convinced her for a while that he had. The one thing I know for certain after everything that happened, after Vernon and the folders and the calls and the 7 months of legal proceedings, is this. The quality of a person's character is not revealed by what they do when things are easy. It's revealed by what they choose to do when the easier choice is to do nothing. I could have driven home that night and told myself it wasn't my place. I could have told myself Iris was an adult and it was her decision. Those things are technically true. They are also the kinds of true things people say when they want permission to look away. I wasn't raised to look away. And neither, I found out, was my daughter.